In the first rectangle here, we're going to start out with hatching. So hatching is just singular lines. And practice fading from light to dark. So on the left side it's light, the right side it's darker. I like to start with the darker side first, but up to you if you want to start out with the light side. But when it's darker, you want to make your lines closer together and continuously overlapping them. So layers are great to work with for hatching so that you can create a smooth and consistent blend or fade from dark to light. So on the right side, again, I'm just overlapping that darker area a couple times, making it a lot darker, trying to smooth out that fade from the dark to light. You don't want to see an area where you can tell that it cuts from dark to light. You want to see that smooth fade so you're not able to see the transition. Then jumping down to the second box, what we're working on is cross-hatching. So cross-hatching is going to give your finished product a slightly different look. It's going to be a little bit more textured. So think about which of these techniques you're going to be wanting to continue working with. But cross-hatching is similar to hatching where you're just going across it in different directions. So here I'm going across the cross-hatching 2 or 3 times. So I started with my vertical lines, and I'll go back and play that one more time. So I'm starting out with my vertical lines for cross hatching, and same thing with hatching, you want to try to fade this from dark to light. So I'm going over it a few times, just making it a smooth fade. And then I'm starting to add my lines going in opposite directions. And again, on the side that's light, I'm starting to spread my lines further apart in order to keep it consistent. And then I'm fading my lines closer and closer together, pressing harder as I get towards the dark side. So that is cross-hatching. The next section, or the third rectangle here, is called parallel hatching, which is very similar to hatching where we're using line, but this one we are keeping our lines from overlapping. So this will create a different kind of unique texture on your final portrait and your final project. So definitely something to try out and see how it looks, how you like it, and how you might want to apply it. There's a lot of different things you can do with this technique. Be creative with the placement and angle of your lines. So you can see there's no really set way or place to put your lines with parallel hatching. The main thing to think about with parallel hatching is just continuing to emphasize value change. So you'll start to see this fade from dark to light as I go. In the darker areas on the far right, I overlapped or made my lines a lot thicker, still having space in between them, but I drew over top to emphasize that value change a lot more. And then as I went towards the left or the lighter side, I began to spread out my lines and made those kind of angles a little bit different to create a lighter value. So I'm pressing lighter with my pen and spacing out my design. But you really could do a lot with this. You can do a lot of different designs. You could even try out different shapes. So maybe drawing some triangles or some squares and circles. So be creative with your parallel hatching, but again, this is just keeping things from overlapping. The next section is called a rough edge, and we'll just use hatching for the rough edge, but you could also do cross hatching with this. And this is great to practice so that when you go to add line onto your final project, you're not ending your lines or ending your hatching marks in the exact same spot. If you're ending your lines or your hatching marks in the same spot, it's going to look very choppy. So creating a rough edge is great to create more of a smooth transition from one section to the next. So you can see here with the rough edge, I'm just leaving the top blank, and then I'm making sure none of these lines stop at the exact same spot. What you could do is a couple layers of this. So maybe I could have done a layer where they all kind of stop at this top spot, and then a second layer where they stop at more of a medium spot, and then a lower layer. So layers definitely help to create more of this smooth fade, but you're going to want to use rough edges as you're working on your final projects. Now we're going to be moving on to these 3 circles, so applying these different techniques into the circles here. In each of the spheres on your handout, there are lighter circles on top of them. Those lighter circles are separating out value change. So picture the smallest circle as your highlight, The next section is going to be your medium tone, and then the bottom outside section is your shadow. So as you're working on your final project, applying these cross contour and cross hatching lines, it's really important to always pay attention to value change. So find the lightest areas and try to really emphasize those as being light, leaving them blank, or separating your lines out further. And then as you get towards the darker section, starting to overlap your lines. The other thing we're going to be working on with these spheres is following the contour. So making our lines follow the same shape as the outside of the circle. So as I'm working, you'll notice I'm not drawing my lines straight, but they are curving around the outside of the sphere, just following that exact same shape on the outside here, and then continuing to curve as I get towards the highlight. So this first sphere we're just using hatching. So I'm going to be making my lines just going in one direction. They're not overlapping each other. You could do this a couple ways. What I'm doing is using shorter strokes for hatching. However, you could also use long continuous strokes that go around the entire outside of the sphere. So maybe try out the different types of strokes on this or lengths and see what works the best for you. Everyone's going to have a different style when you get to your final project. This practice is all about figuring out which techniques work the best for you, emphasizing form and showing value change. So again, all of these lines are going in the same direction as the outside of the circle, and this is going to help make the circle more three-dimensional, or the sphere more three-dimensional, by having these lines going with the same curve as the contour of the sphere. So as I get towards that highlight in the middle, I am keeping areas light, making my lines separated further apart. Moving on to the second sphere here, this one we're using parallel hatching. So again, this is where your lines are not overlapping, but you're still showing value change and you're still emphasizing form. So you can still draw your lines in specific directions to continue to emphasize the form. So the ones that I'm drawing on the side are still curving with the same kind of form or curve as the outside of the sphere. This way, or this specific hatching technique, it is a little bit trickier to follow the contour because you're going to be drawing your lines going in different directions. But for the most part, just try to keep in mind following form with these. If you want to make straight lines versus curved lines, you could definitely do that to see what the different effects look like. In this outside rim, I am making sure that my lines are closest together. And then as I get further apart, so you'll notice in this next section, I'm starting to make my lines spread a little bit further apart here so that the value change and contrast is emphasized. So definitely take your time on this one, be creative with it, with the placement of things and how your lines look. In the darker areas, just overlap your lines or go over the lines a couple times to make them a little bit thicker. Then in this last section, we're going to be using cross hatching with rough edges. So every time I'm drawing these lines, I'm trying to make sure that they're ending in different places so that they're not going to look separate or kind of chunky as they're getting filled in. I'm starting out with just hatching, so I went all the way around just like what I did with the hatching sphere, but now I'm adding my lines going in the opposite direction, so going across what I had before. And this is going to continue to emphasize form, so instead of drawing these lines flat or straight, I curved them in towards the center or in towards the highlight. So think about the form and what the shape of that object is going to look like. As a general rule, you can look at the outside shape, so the outside of the sphere I'm following this way. And then as I'm coming in towards the middle of my sphere, I'm looking now at the outside over here and just replicating that shape. So always look at the form and try to follow and fill in the contour the best that you can.